Hey, amazing people. If you're subscribed, then you're a legend. Thank you so much. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please smash that sub button and join the family.
I'll never forget the day I got that lamp. It's funny how something so stupidly simple turned into something that still haunts me. I was scrolling through Craigslist one afternoon, trying to find some cheap stuff to furnish my new apartment. I was broke, like fresh out of college broke, so anything under $10 was good enough. That's when I saw it, a vintage lamp for only $5. The picture looked kind of weird. It was old-fashioned, kind of rusty looking, but the price was too good to pass up. The description was even weirder. The guy said it was his grandmother's, that it was perfectly functional, but he was cleaning out his place and needed to get rid of it ASAP. He gave no address, just said I had to pick it up from the McDonald's parking lot down the road. I thought it was a little odd, but hey, $5 for a lamp. Whatever. I had a car and I needed a lamp. I texted him and we did the plan. He didn't seem super eager to talk much, just gave me the details. Said he'd be there around 3 p.m. Nothing seemed too weird. People are strange, right? Maybe he was just embarrassed about his house being a mess. It happens. So I get to the McDonald's parking lot. I'm sitting in my car, scrolling through my phone, waiting for some old dad to show up. I'm thinking this is the weirdest Craigslist transaction I've done, but I've done worse. Right then, I see him. This old man shuffling through the parking lot wearing this ratty jacket, his face all wrinkled and pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. He's holding a plastic bag, but the weird part is it's really light. I don't know why I noticed that, but I did. He walks up to my car, hands me the bag without saying much, then turns and walks away without even a thank you. Weird, but whatever. I'm not gonna question it. I look at the bag and pull out the lamp. It was way older than I thought, brass-colored, almost tarnished, with some weird symbols scratched into it. But hey, it looked cool enough. I didn't think about it much more. I was just excited to have a cheap lamp. I drove home, threw it on my desk, plugged it in, and turned it on. It lit up just fine. Nothing strange about it at all. I sat down on the couch with a book, just relaxing after the whole ordeal. My cat, Nemo, a fluffy black thing, jumped up on the table, knocked a few things over, and bumped into the lamp. I heard something hit the floor and glanced over. At first, I thought it was just one of those tiny lamp pieces that always fall off older stuff. But then I saw it. A small black object rolled out from underneath the lamp. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was some tiny piece of the lamp that fell off, right? But when I picked it up, I saw it was a tiny camera. It was so small and sleek, I had no idea how I hadn't noticed it before. I turned it over, and the first thing I saw was the lens. And that's when it hit me. I looked at the lamp, then the camera, and then it hit me again. This was a recording device. I stared at it for a good minute, the blood draining from my face. I knew I shouldn't have plugged that lamp in. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I couldn't breathe for a second. I ran my fingers over the camera, turned it on, and what I saw made my stomach churn. There was footage. Footage of my apartment, the place I thought was private. It was from my living room, just a few feet away from where I was sitting right then. The camera was tiny enough that it had blended right in with the lamp's base. The first thought that came to my mind was that it had been recording me. There was video of me reading, sitting at my desk, just living my life. The more I looked at it, the more I realized how long this had been going on. There were hours of footage, and none of it looked accidental. The worst part, I could see my cat Nemo brushing against the lamp earlier. That was it. That was when the camera had fallen out. I felt sick. I felt dirty. I didn't even know what to do. I grabbed my phone and immediately tried calling the police. But there was a problem. I didn't even know the guy's name, let alone where he lived. All I had was his phone number, and honestly, it didn't feel like enough to go off of. I had no idea if the number was even real. It didn't feel real. How the hell was I supposed to find this guy? I thought maybe I could trace the camera or find some way to get more info off the footage, but I wasn't tech savvy enough for that. I had no clue what to do, other than try to forget about it. But as I kept watching the footage, the more I realized I couldn't. The idea that someone had been watching me like this, someone I didn't even know, sent a wave of panic through me. What if he had a whole set of these cameras? What if I wasn't the only one? I felt like I was suffocating. I kept looking at the camera, then the lamp, wondering if there were more devices hidden in the damn thing. I turned the whole thing upside down, tapped it, tried to figure out if there were any other hidden surprises, but nothing else fell out. I spent the whole night in a paranoid mess, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that old man's face, shuffling off into the distance, probably laughing at me. I was this close to just throwing the lamp out, smashing it, getting rid of everything. But what if there were more of them out there? What if I wasn't the only one he was watching? The next day, I managed to get the police involved. They were able to track down the number to an address, but by the time they got to the place, it was abandoned. The guy was gone. And the worst part, I didn't even know what to think anymore. It felt like I was in a bad movie, the kind where you know the ending is going to be messed up. I'm not sure what happened to the lamp or the guy, but after that, I threw everything out. The lamp, the footage, the whole mess. The more I think about it, the more I wish I never answered that ad. Maybe there's more people out there like him, hiding cameras and stuff, just waiting to catch someone off guard. I don't know, but I'll never trust a Craigslist ad again. I never thought selling a stupid old TV on Craigslist would be anything more than an easy way to clear out some space in my apartment. I mean, it was just a 32-inch flat screen that I barely used anymore. I thought it would be a quick sale, the kind of deal that's done in 20 minutes. The buyer gets their TV, I get a few extra bucks, and we both walk away happy. That's what I thought. But man, I could not have been more wrong. The ad went up without much thought, just a quick description and a price tag. I figured it'd be gone within a few days. The TV still worked fine, just didn't have a place in my life anymore. As soon as the ad went live, my phone started buzzing with messages. A couple of them seemed weird, but one stood out. The guy said he could pick it up right now, no questions, no hassle. Cool, right? I didn't think anything of it. We agreed to meet in the parking lot of a grocery store nearby. I figured it'd be a decent public place to do the exchange. I had nothing to worry about. People meet in parking lots all the time, right? Besides, I wasn't about to let some guy into my apartment to pick it up. He told me he'd be there in 30 minutes, so I just threw the TV in the back of my car, grabbed my keys, and drove over. When I pulled into the lot, I saw a guy standing by his car. He looked like he was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, kind of weathered with a rough-looking face. His clothes were worn, and his hands were covered in what looked like dirt. I didn't think anything of it at the time. He seemed harmless enough. I got out of my car with the TV, and he walked over to me, holding out a wad of cash. He didn't even look at the TV. He just looked at me, his eyes a little too intense. I figured he'd check it once we started talking, but he didn't. He just handed me the money, and I handed him the TV. But when I touched the bills, something fell off. I looked down, and that's when I saw it. The money was wet. Not soaking, but enough to notice. And it wasn't just wet, it was stained. Red. A dark, rusty shade of red. At first, I thought it was maybe some kind of dye or just dirty money. But then I took a closer look and realized it wasn't just some weird color. There was a streak of it across the edge of the bills, and it was fresh, like real blood. My stomach dropped. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't know what to do. Was I supposed to just hand the TV over and leave, or was this some kind of sick joke? I had no clue. The guy didn't notice me staring at the cash. He just nodded and turned around, already walking back to his car. He didn't even seem to care that I was holding this blood-stained money in my hands. It was almost like it didn't matter to him at all. I almost didn't know what to say. I was so freaked out, but I didn't want to make a scene, so I just shoved the bills into my pocket. I tried not to think about it too much. Maybe he'd gotten the money from some kind of sketchy source, I thought. Maybe he was just one of those guys who didn't give a damn. But then I heard him speak as he was getting into his car, and the words stuck with me long after. He casually mentioned that he'd been out hunting earlier. Hunting. I didn't think much of it at first. People go hunting all the time. But something in the way he said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't like he was excited or happy about it. It was just matter of fact, like he was stating the most normal thing in the world. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't. The more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. Hunting. He didn't mention what he'd been hunting. He didn't even mention what kind of animal, just hunting. I should ask more questions, I know, but I didn't. I just let him drive off, still holding the bloodied cash in my pocket. I wish I'd done something different. I went home with the TV, but I couldn't get it out of my head. The blood, the cash, the way he acted. It felt like I was part of something messed up, something I didn't want any part of, but I didn't know how to get out of it now. The TV was just a stupid transaction, right? It was just some guy who maybe had a bad night or got his hands dirty while hunting. It didn't matter. But still, that feeling didn't go away. Later that night, I sat on my couch staring at the TV, trying to distract myself from what had happened. The whole thing felt wrong, like it wasn't just a bad deal. It felt like I had been caught in the middle of something that was way darker than I realized. I tried to brush it off, but I kept seeing that image of the blood on the bills in my mind. Was it a warning? Maybe he wasn't as normal as he seemed. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that it was nothing. But every time I closed my eyes, I could see the money again. The blood. It wasn't just a stain, it was fresh. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise in my apartment made me jump. Every time a car passed by outside, I thought it was him coming back. What if I'd been caught up in something dangerous? What if he had something to do with the blood? What if he'd been hunting people? The next day, I went to check the cash again. I had stuffed it in my jeans pocket after the transaction, but I had barely thought about it since. But I couldn't get the image out of my head, so I pulled it out and examined it more closely. The blood had dried, and the bills didn't look as strange anymore. But the thing that freaked me out the most was a small detail on one of the bills. A tiny fingerprint. It wasn't clear enough to make out, but it was there. A thumbprint pressed into the paper almost as if he grabbed it in a hurry. My hand started to shake. I couldn't keep ignoring it anymore. I had to know who this guy was. I had to know what he was involved in. But every time I thought about it, I got a sick feeling in my stomach. Something told me that I should just forget the whole thing. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. I threw the bills in the trash. I went to wash my hands of it. I never saw the guy again, and I haven't sold anything on Craigslist since. Some things you just can't unsee. I'll never look at buying or selling a car the same way again. It started like any other Craigslist transaction. Guy wanted to buy my car, came over to check it out, asked to test drive it. But what went down next, I still can't get the image out of my head. I had this old car that I've been trying to sell for a few weeks. It was a solid vehicle, nothing fancy, but it ran. I had no use for it anymore, and it was just sitting in my driveway. I posted the ad, and as expected, I got a few bites. One guy seemed pretty serious, texting me back and forth about the details. He wasn't asking for a lot of pictures or back and forth questions. Seemed to be in a rush, but I figured he was just eager to get a good deal. He told me to come by that afternoon to check it out. I was a little skeptical at first because he didn't ask for the VIN or a list of past repairs, but again, maybe he just wanted to see the car in person. Whatever. People act weird all the time on Craigslist. The guy shows up in a beat-up truck, late 20s, kind of scruffy looking. He had this impatient energy like he had somewhere to be. I didn't think much of it, just figured he was excited about the car. We walked around it for a bit. He inspected the tires, checked the interior, started the engine, all the usual stuff. Everything seemed normal. Then he asked if he could take it for a test drive. Now, I didn't normally let people drive my car without me in it, but I was in a hurry too and just wanted the deal to go through. I mean, what's the worst that could happen, right? So I agreed, and we headed to the car. As we were walking toward the car, my friend Danny, who was just hanging out with me that day, was still sitting on the porch. I told him to just keep an eye on things. I wasn't too worried. What could go wrong with a normal test drive? Little did I know this would turn into a nightmare. The guy gets into the driver's seat, and I hop into the passenger side. I didn't think anything of it, but as soon as I shut the door, he slams the lock down and starts the engine. I thought it was weird, but maybe he just did it automatically. I asked if he was good to go, and he just nodded, his eyes focused straight ahead. I didn't think much of it until he slammed the car into reverse and pedaled out of the driveway. I immediately felt a rush of panic. It was like everything happened in slow motion. I tried to reach for the door handle, but it was locked. I started to shout, but by then he was already speeding down the street. The car wasn't moving like it was supposed to. It was struggling, hesitating between gears. I wasn't sure if it was because he didn't know how to drive it or if something was wrong with the car. But then that's what hit me. My car had a special ghost lock system. A few months earlier, I'd had the car upgraded with an anti-theft system. It was a bit of an overkill, but I wanted peace of mind. The system worked by requiring a special sequence of button presses on the key fob for the car to start up properly. If someone didn't have the code, the engine would sputter and fail to start or run. I knew exactly what to do because I set it up myself, but this guy, he had no idea what was going on. I wasn't exactly sure what he was planning, but I could tell that the engine wasn't turning over properly. He kept slamming the gas, trying to get it to go faster, but it wasn't happening. That's when it clicked in my mind. He wasn't just taking it for a test drive. He was trying to steal my car. I didn't have time to think. I started banging on the window, yelling at him to pull over, but he just kept glancing at me nervously. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and I realized he was looking for a way out. He kept pulling on the steering wheel, trying to turn the car, but it wasn't going anywhere. I looked at Danny. He was still on the porch, and he saw what was happening. Without hesitation, he bolted out of the house, running toward my car. He must have realized what was going on too, because I could see him dialing his phone. The guy in the car was getting frantic. I think he finally realized that the engine wasn't going to work like it was supposed to, and that's when he started making moves to ditch the car. He turned the wheel sharply, trying to swerve toward the alley, but the car was barely responding. That's when I saw Danny running full speed, coming straight toward the passenger side of the car. In a panic, the guy tried to yank open the door, but I had already locked it. I think he expected it to be easy. He was starting to sweat, his hands gripping the wheel tight, but he couldn't get the door open. At this point, Danny was just a few feet away, and that's when I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I reached over and grabbed the guy by the wrist, yanking him away from the door. He yelped and tried to pull away, but I wasn't about to let him go. He was strong, but I had the element of surprise. I yanked him hard enough to get him out of the seat, and that's when Danny grabbed him too, pulling him out of the driver's side. The guy stumbled out of the car, trying to run, but Danny was on him like a dog on a bone. It struggled for a moment, and I jumped out of the car to help. We tackled him to the ground, and that's when I heard the sirens in the distance. Danny must have called the cops the moment he saw what was going down. It wasn't long before the police showed up, cuffing the guy and dragging him to their car. They asked us a bunch of questions, but I was still in shock. The whole thing felt like it happened in a blink of an eye. 1 second, I'm showing the guy the car, and the next, he's trying to take it and run. Apparently, the guy had a history of stealing cars. They found a few stolen items in his truck when they searched it. I don't know exactly how long he had been doing this, but I guess I was just the unlucky one to cross paths with him. After the whole mess was over, I had the car checked out by a mechanic to make sure nothing was broken. The ghost lock system had done its job, and the car was fine. I sold it to someone else a few weeks later, but I'll never forget that moment when the guy locked the doors and tried to take off. That was the moment I realized, no matter how careful you think you are, there's always someone out there looking for a way to take what's not theirs. I've always been a little too trusting. When it comes to buying stuff on Craigslist, I like to think I've had a good sense for the deal. Usually it's been fine buying or selling used phones, game consoles, or whatever. But after what happened with this iPhone, I've definitely become way more cautious. Honestly, if I could go back and just skip the whole thing, I would. But I can't. So, here's the story. It all started when I decided my old phone just wasn't cutting it anymore. I mean, it was fine for calls and text messages, but it was slow, constantly freezing, and the battery drained so fast, I could barely make it through half a day. I wanted something new, but I didn't have the cash for a brand new phone. Instead, I figured I'd just look on Craigslist for a good deal on a used one. I found an ad for an iPhone 11. The price seemed reasonable, a bit below market value, but not suspiciously low, which made me think it was legit. The woman selling it said it was in great condition, and she was willing to meet me at a nearby gas station to do the exchange. I figured no big deal, it was a public place. Plus, I've met people in parking lots before. It felt safe enough. We set up the meeting for that afternoon. I didn't get any weird vibes from her messages. She seemed friendly enough, even texting me a few extra pictures of the phone. Everything looked good, no cracks, no scratches, all the original accessories. I was pretty excited. I've always loved getting a good deal. I showed up to the gas station on time, parked near the pumps, and waited. The place wasn't too crowded, just a few cars here and there. I was standing by my car, checking my phone for any updates when I saw a woman walking toward me. She was in her mid-30s, maybe a little disheveled, but not in a way that seemed sketchy. She had a tote bag slung over her shoulder, and she was holding the phone out in front of her. She smiled and waved. I smiled back and walked over to her. She handed me the phone, and I was about to pull out the cash when everything went sideways. Out of nowhere, he was fast. This guy grabbed the woman by the arm, pulling her back, and before I could even process what was happening, he shoved her to the ground. I froze, standing there, my mind racing. The woman was screaming, but it wasn't like a fight scream. It was more like she was panicking. And then, within a split second, the guy was on top of her, wrestling her down with this crazy speed. I started looking around, trying to see if anyone else was noticing what was going on. I thought maybe it was some kind of robbery, but it didn't feel like that. No one else in the gas station seemed to be reacting, just kind of minding their own business, getting gas or going inside. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The guy was pulling a badge out of his pocket. It was shiny and looked official. He shouted something about theft, and "You're under arrest." The woman looked like she was trying to get away. The guy was just too strong. She was fighting back, struggling to get out of his grip, but he wasn't letting go. At this point, I'm standing there, absolutely dumbfounded. I had no clue what was happening. The woman looked so freaked out. She was still holding the phone in her hand, and I noticed something, a weird mark on the back of it. A little scratch, but it wasn't from normal wear and tear. It looked almost like the phone had been altered in some way. But I didn't really get a chance to think about it because the cop, who was still holding her down, flashed his badge again and turned to me. I stood there, still processing what had just happened, not really sure how to react. My mouth went dry. This whole situation was spiraling fast, and I wasn't sure where I fit into all of it. The cop looked at me, his eyes scanning me up and down, probably trying to figure out if I was involved in any way. He asked if I knew the woman, and I just shook my head, completely confused. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't even know this woman's name. The cop finally got the woman under control and stood up, pulling her to her feet. She was crying, but she didn't seem to be struggling anymore. The cop pulled out a pair of handcuffs and slapped them on her wrists. He said something about her stealing the phone, and that's when I started to piece things together. Apparently, the iPhone she had been selling me was stolen. It wasn't even hers. The cop said the woman had been using fake accounts and selling stolen phones all over the area. This wasn't her first time getting caught either. She had been involved in a ring of thieves who were taking phones from other people's cars, breaking into houses, and then flipping them on Craigslist for a quick buck. I guess I was just unlucky enough to fall into her trap. My heart was pounding. I couldn't believe it. I thought it was just buying a used phone. I had no clue what I had walked into. I started getting a little freaked out myself, like was I an accessory to this whole thing? I hadn't done anything wrong, but now I felt like I was in way over my head. The cop asked me if I had the money with me. I said I did and pulled it out, showing the cash. I figured that would be the end of it. But the whole situation just didn't sit right with me. I was scared. Here I was standing in front of a gas station, holding cash for a phone that wasn't even mine to begin with. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know what would happen next. Was I going to be questioned? Was I going to be held responsible for anything? It felt like I had gotten tangled up in something way bigger than I had bargained for. After what felt like forever, another police car pulled up, and a couple more officers got out. They started talking to the original cop, and he told them what had happened. One of the new officers came up to me and asked me if I was okay. I nodded, still in shock. They took the woman away in the back of the police car. I watched her face pressed up against the window as the car drove off. She wasn't looking at me anymore. I didn't know if she even remembered me. But in that moment, I felt like I had been a part of something far bigger than just a Craigslist deal gone wrong. The cops gave me the phone, told me to go home, and made sure to explain that I wasn't in trouble, but I had to be careful about where I was buying stuff from now on. They said I was lucky I hadn't already handed over the money, or it would have been harder to track down the stolen goods. When I got home, I looked at the phone again. It looked the same, but now it was just a reminder of how quickly things can go sideways. I threw it in a drawer and haven't touched it since. I've never had the best luck with cars. I don't know if it's because I'm just bad at picking them, or if I'm the kind of person who always gets the short end of the stick, but something about this truck was different. When I found it on Craigslist, I didn't think twice. It seemed perfect for me, cheap, solid build, And the owner was a guy who seemed like he just needed to get rid of it fast. A 2004 Chevy Silverado running fine with a little rust, but nothing major. The price was dirt cheap, and the guy didn't seem sketchy. Maybe I was just too eager to get my hands on a truck. After all, I'd been looking for months, and my old set-in wasn't cutting it anymore. When I showed up at the guy's house to buy it, everything seemed normal. He wasn't some shady dealer. He was just a regular guy who looked like he was moving across the state and needed the cash. I checked out the truck, drove it around the block, and everything seemed fine. The engine purred, the brakes worked, and the tires were solid. It wasn't the prettiest thing, but for the price, I didn't care. I handed over the cash, signed the papers, and took it home. That was the beginning of one of the weirdest and most terrifying days of my life. Fast forward to a week later. I had just gotten around to taking the truck into a local mechanic for some fixes. There were a couple of things I noticed that needed attention. Nothing major, just a few things to make it run smoother. I wasn't about to drive it without checking it out first. I figured while I was getting the oil changed, they could look over the brakes and check for any other little issues. I dropped the truck off at the shop, told them I'd be back in a few hours to pick it up, and went out my day. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I was just happy to have the truck and be one step closer to getting it in perfect condition. About an hour later, I got a call from the mechanic. He didn't sound too serious at first, just told me that everything was going well and they were just finishing up with the oil change. But then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Hey, just a heads up," he said. "We found something in the trunk. You might want to come down here and check it out." At first, I thought maybe it was just an old tool or some junk someone had left in there. I didn't think much of it. But something in his voice made me uneasy. It wasn't the kind of tone I expected. It wasn't like he was just calling to tell me there was an old bottle of soda in the back. So I headed down to the shop. The whole drive there, I couldn't shake this weird feeling. I had no idea what could be in the trunk, but it didn't sit right with me. I wasn't expecting a surprise, but somehow I knew this wasn't going to be just some old junk. When I got there, the mechanic was already waiting by the truck. He was pacing around a little, looking nervous. He told me to follow him to the back, and as we got closer, I saw that the trunk was open. He had already popped it, but he was standing in front of it, almost like he was blocking me from seeing inside. "Look, man, I don't know how to explain this," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just tell me. What's going on?" I asked. I didn't like where this was going. He stepped aside, and I finally saw what was inside. There, sitting in the trunk, was a large black duffel bag. It was zipped up, and I could see the edges of something white sticking out from the top. My heart sank. I reached for the bag, but the mechanic stopped me. "I don't think you should open that," he said. "I don't know what it is, but I don't like the look of it." Of course, the first thing that came to my mind was that special powder hint. That's the obvious thing, right? I mean, it's what you think of when you see a suspicious bag in a truck. And the weird thing is, the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't thought to check the trunk when I first bought the truck. Why hadn't I? But at the time, I was just happy to get the deal. I should have been smarter. Without wasting another second, I took out my phone and called the police. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't about to open the bag myself. The whole situation felt so wrong. The mechanic wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the bag like it was going to jump out and bite him. When the cops arrived, they didn't hesitate. They asked me to step away from the truck while they examined the bag. I could see the look in their eyes. They didn't say anything, but they didn't need to. Their faces told me everything. They pulled out the duffel bag carefully, unzipped it, and inside, just like I'd feared, was a large amount of white powder. It was sealed in plastic, stacked in bricks. I don't even know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't good. One of the officers turned to me, his face hard. He asked me if I knew what was in the bag, and of course I said no. He asked if I had any idea why it was in my truck. Again, I said no. I was just as confused as he was. I couldn't get a straight answer from the guy who sold me the truck, either. All I knew was that I had just unknowingly bought a vehicle with illegal substances in the trunk. I felt like I was going to puke. The cops took me aside and started asking more questions. At first, I thought it was just a formality, like they were just doing their job. But then they started acting like they didn't believe me. They took my ID, checked out my background, and kept asking me if I had any connection to the stuff in the trunk. I kept telling them I had no idea. All I knew was that I'd bought the truck from some guy on Craigslist, and that was it. But they didn't seem to buy it. They put me in the back of a squad car for questioning. I was there for what felt like hours, being grilled by different officers. I tried to stay calm, but I had no clue where this was going. Was I getting arrested for something I didn't even do? Finally, they let me go, but not before making sure I understood how serious the situation was. They told me I was cleared for now, but I'd be hearing from them again. They told me the investigation would continue, and they would be looking into the guy who sold me the truck. They didn't give me any more details, but I knew it wasn't over. I don't think I'll ever forget the look on that mechanic's face when the cops started investigating the truck. He was just as clueless as me, but something about the way he acted made me feel like maybe he knew more than he was letting on. Maybe he didn't have anything to do with it. I'm still not sure. At the end of the day, I got my truck back, but it wasn't the deal I thought it was. I guess Craigslist can be a real gamble sometimes, and in my case, it almost turned into something a whole lot worse than a bad deal. Let me tell you how it all went down, so maybe you'll understand why I'm never trusting Craigslist again. It all started when I was behind on bills. Life had been tough recently: rent, utilities, food, everything was piling up. I wasn't getting any extra hours at work, and my paycheck was barely covering the essentials. I had to do something, and fast. That's when I remembered my old gaming chair. It was a decent chair, had some wear and tear, but still perfectly functional. It wasn't worth much, but I figured I could get at least $200 for it. I had bought it for around $300 a few years ago, but like most things, it just started collecting dust after I stopped gaming as much. So I went ahead and listed it on Craigslist for $200. No harm, right? The response was pretty quick. Within a couple of hours, I had someone message me saying they were interested and wanted to pick it up that evening. I was a little surprised at how fast it was happening, but at that point, I was too desperate to think much about it. The guy texted me when he was close, and I told him to meet me outside my apartment. I wasn't too worried since I'd sold stuff on Craigslist before, and I'd never had any problems. When he showed up, he seemed like a normal guy, mid-30s, dressed in a hoodie and jeans. He didn't look like anything out of the ordinary. He came over, took a look at the chair, and then handed me $250 in cash. I was a bit thrown off at first. The chair was listed for $200, so I figured he was just being generous, or maybe thought it was worth more than I priced it. I told him I was fine with the $250 and offered to give him the change, but he waved it off, saying, "Nah, keep the change." I was confused but didn't argue. Honestly, I needed the money, so I thanked him, and he left with the chair. It wasn't until I was walking to the bank to deposit the cash that things started to feel off. I was excited, thinking about how much closer I was to paying my bills. I walked into the bank, stood in line, and when it was my turn, I handed over the $250 to the teller. She looked at the money for a second, then started to scan the bills. That's when the trouble began. She gave me this strange look and told me she needed to verify the money. At first, I thought she was just being extra cautious because it was a large amount, but then I saw her call over another employee. They both started whispering and passing the money back and forth. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I figured maybe they had to do some extra checks for some reason. A few minutes later, the employee came back and asked me to step aside. I was getting nervous now, thinking something was wrong. She told me they'd have to confiscate the bills because they were counterfeit. I froze. I had no idea what she was talking about. I thought maybe there had been a mistake. I kept telling her I didn't know anything about it, that I was just doing what anyone would do, trying to pay my bills. I wasn't some kind of criminal, but the more I tried to explain myself, the more they just gave me these blank stares. They didn't listen. They took the money from me, and the next thing I knew, I was sitting in a small office with one of the bank employees and a police officer. The officer kept asking me where I got the money. I tried to explain that I just sold my gaming chair, and the guy had handed me the cash, but they didn't seem to care about my story. I started to panic. I hadn't even done anything wrong. I just needed the money to pay my bills, and I was sitting there feeling like I was caught in some huge mess I couldn't get out of. The officer asked if I knew the guy who had sold me the money. He even suggested that maybe I was in on it. That's when the whole thing started to feel like a nightmare. I had never met the guy before. He had just come by to pick up the chair, and I was dumb enough to not think about checking the money before he left. They told me they'd investigate the guy who bought the chair from me, but they couldn't guarantee anything would happen right away. I just sat there, numb, thinking about how I had gone from being behind on my bills to having my money taken away, all because I trusted a random guy off Craigslist. It's been days now, and I haven't heard anything back from the police. I don't even know if they're going to catch the guy or if I'll get my money back. What's worse is I'm just stuck in this never-ending loop of bad decisions. I know I should have been smarter. Should have checked the bills before I even walked into the bank, but in my desperation, I didn't. I thought I was doing something good, getting rid of that old chair and making some quick cash. But it turned into the opposite of what I expected. Now I'm left without that extra $250 and with no chair. To make it worse, the bank told me they couldn't give me back the fake money. I had no proof that I'd even gotten it in the first place. The whole situation feels like a trap I fell into, and I'm not sure what to do next. Honestly, I don't even know if I want to go near Craigslist ever again. What's supposed to be a simple transaction can easily turn into something dark and twisted. I never expected to be a part of some kind of counterfeit scheme just because I was trying to sell an old chair to pay my bills. But here I am, stuck with nothing to show for it but a headache and a lesson learned the hard way. So to anyone thinking about using Craigslist for anything, be careful. Double check the cash you get. You never know when someone's going to slip you a counterfeit bill and leave you holding the bag. I've sold a bunch of things on Craigslist over the years, from old furniture to gadgets I no longer needed. It's usually pretty straightforward, nothing too wild. But what happened when I tried selling my old laptop? That's a whole different story. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting around the house trying to figure out how to make some extra cash. I had an old laptop I didn't really use anymore. It wasn't the latest model, but it still worked fine. I figured I could get a decent amount for it, maybe $400 or so. That would cover a few bills and maybe leave me with a little extra to treat myself. I posted an ad on Craigslist, and within a couple of hours, I had a few responses. Most of them were the usual lowball offers, but then I got a message from a guy who seemed pretty interested. He said he wanted to come by and check it out. He said he'd be there in about an hour. Normally, I would have felt a little sketchy about someone coming over, but I was pretty used to it by now. I'd sold things before, and I always met people in public places or had someone with me. But this guy just seemed chill in his messages, so I didn't think much of it. He pulled up outside my place in an old sedan, the kind that looked like it had seen better days. He got out, a guy in his mid-30s wearing a worn-out hoodie and jeans. I wasn't expecting much. He looked like the kind of guy who was just looking for a deal, which, let's be honest, most people on Craigslist are. I showed him the laptop, let him inspect it for a minute. He seemed pretty happy with it at first, typing away, checking everything out. At this point, I thought everything was going fine. Then came the price talk. I told him I was asking for $400, which, considering the condition of the laptop and what I had paid for it years ago, seemed like a fair price. He paused for a second, looking at the laptop in his hands, and then he tossed out a number, $100. Now, I'm not new to Craigslist haggling. People lowball all the time, and sometimes I'm open to negotiating. But this, $100 for a laptop that was still in good condition. I wasn't having it. I told him flat out that $100 was way too low. I said $400 was the price, take it or leave it. At this point, I expected him to either walk away or maybe offer $250 or $300 if he was feeling generous. But instead he got weird, his face twisted into something like a sneer. He stood up, holding the laptop in one hand, and just stared at me for a second. I didn't know what was going through his head, but I could tell he wasn't too happy. Before I even had time to react, he lifted the laptop over his head and in one swift motion, smashed it onto the concrete floor. It all happened so fast. The sound of it shattering was like a slap to the face, louder than I expected. I just stood there, frozen for a second, watching the screen crack into pieces. The thing was ruined. There was no way to fix it. And then he just turned around and bolted. He didn't even look back. He ran straight to his car, got in, and sped off like a bat out of hell. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. It was like the whole situation flipped on its head in a matter of seconds. I don't know why, but I stood there for a minute, just staring at the broken laptop on the ground. I think I was in shock. It wasn't even the loss of the laptop that hit me the hardest. It was the fact that this guy had just straight up destroyed something that wasn't even his, all because I wouldn't give in to his ridiculous offer. I couldn't get my head around it. Who does that? The anger kicked in pretty quickly after that, and I pulled out my phone to call the cops. I tried to keep calm while explaining what happened. The dispatcher told me to stay where I was, so I did, still staring at the mess in front of me, trying to process what had just gone down. The cops took a while to show up. They asked me if I had gotten a good look at the guy, and I told them everything I could remember. He wasn't exactly someone I could easily pick out of a crowd, but I gave them the details. His car was a beater, so maybe that would help, but by the time they got to the neighborhood, he was long gone. The cops asked if I had any security cameras or witnesses, but I didn't. I didn't even think about the fact that I should have gotten a better look at the guy's face when he first showed up. I was too focused on the transaction to think something might go sideways. They said they'd keep an eye out for the car, but I knew deep down that this guy would probably be long gone by the time they started looking for him. I was pissed. I was out $400, my laptop was ruined, and all because this guy didn't want to accept that his offer was way too low. The police gave me a case number, but honestly, I didn't expect much to come from it. Craigslist transactions aren't exactly high on their priority list. The whole thing felt so messed up, like I had been taken for a ride and left with nothing to show for it. I think the worst part of it all was just how random it was. I've sold things on Craigslist before, and yeah, you get the occasional weirdos or lowballers, but nothing like this. The guy didn't just walk away or haggle. He went full psycho mode and destroyed my stuff just because I wouldn't drop my price. It was like I was dealing with a person who had zero respect for anyone else's property or time. I've been avoiding Craigslist ever since. I don't think I could stomach doing that kind of transaction again. And every time I think about that laptop, I get mad all over again. It wasn't just about the money. It was the pure disrespect of it all. That guy didn't care about anything except getting his way, and now I was the one left picking up the pieces. Literally. I don't think I'll ever trust anyone I meet on Craigslist again. Ever. This story is still fresh in my mind, and I can't get the whole thing out of my head. It started with something so simple, buying a pair of rare Jordans, and ended up being one of the most messed up situations I've ever been in. I've been hunting for these specific Jordans for months. They were a limited edition, some crazy rare release that had people lining up for days. I knew it was gonna be hard to find them for a decent price, but I was willing to pay. After all, they were the holy grail of sneakers and I couldn't miss out. So when I found them on Craigslist, I didn't hesitate. The guy was asking $1,000, which was a steal, considering how much they were going for in the resale market. Yeah, that was a lot of money that I had been saving for months, and I wasn't going to pass this up. The seller messaged me saying he'd gotten lucky and won the raffle to buy them at retail price. Apparently, he wasn't a huge fan of the shoes, so he wanted to sell them. He seemed pretty chill over text, though something about him felt a little off. He wasn't too pushy or anything, but he kept talking about how he couldn't believe his luck in winning the raffle. Still, I figured it was legit. After all, the shoes were exactly what I wanted, and everything seemed fine at first. He agreed to meet up at a local coffee shop to make the exchange. When I showed up, I couldn't believe my eyes. This guy was holding a box, a sealed, perfect condition box with the exact Jordans I've been eyeing. It was everything I hoped for, and I was practically drooling over them. The seller was friendly, and he immediately pulled the shoes out for me to check. They looked perfect. They were exactly like the ones I had seen online in the pictures. Crisp, shiny, just the right amount of hype around them. The smell of fresh leather hit me as soon as I saw them up close. I told him I liked them, and I was ready to hand over the $1,000. He smiled and nodded, then said he would put them in the sealed box it came in. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, that's where I should have picked up on something strange. Why would he have the shoes out of the box if he was planning to give me the original packaging? Still, I didn't think it was a big deal, and I wasn't gonna let it ruin the excitement of finally getting these Jordans. After I gave him the cash, he packed the shoes in the box, sealed it up, and handed it to me. He smiled and waved as I went to my car, and I didn't think anything more about it. I was on cloud nine, feeling like I had just scored a major win. I couldn't wait to show my girlfriend, so I rushed home with the box in the passenger seat. When I walked in, she was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. I could barely contain my excitement. I told her I had something amazing to show her. I pulled out the box, and we both stared at it for a second. Everything looked perfect. The box was sealed, and there were no signs of it being tampered with. I handed it to her, and she smiled, excited to see the shoes I had been talking about for so long. But when we opened it, I froze. Inside the box, instead of the Jordans I was expecting, there was a pair of crusty old sandals. Not even good sandals, the kind of sandals that looked like they had been worn for years, scuffed up and falling apart. The smell hit me almost immediately. It wasn't anything like the fresh new sneakers I was expecting. These sandals smelled like they had been worn through years of sweat, dirt, and who knows what else. I was in shock. I could feel my stomach dropping, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I stared at them for a solid minute, trying to wrap my mind around what was going on. How could this happen? How was this possible? I looked at the box again, but it was the same one I had received from the seller. The box was sealed just like when I first got it, but now there were old sandals inside. I checked the box, turned it around, and looked at everything. Maybe there was some mistake. Maybe he accidentally switched it, but there was no way in hell. These sandals didn't belong in the box. It didn't belong anywhere near a pair of Jordans. My mind was racing. I immediately grabbed my phone and called the seller. The phone rang for a while before it went to voicemail. I tried texting him, asking him what the hell was going on, but he didn't respond. I called again and again, but no answer. I felt like I was losing it. I couldn't understand how this was happening. I had just handed over $1,000 to this guy, and now he was nowhere to be found. I didn't know what to do. I was angry. I was frustrated. But mostly, I was scared. I couldn't believe I had been scammed like this, but I also had this gut feeling that something else was off about the whole situation. The fact that the box was sealed perfectly made me think this wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. I decided to try one more time to reach him. I went back to Craigslist, but the ad was already taken down. His profile had vanished. Everything was gone. It was like he never existed. At that point, I knew I had been had. There was no way to track him down now, no way to get my money back. I was stuck with a pair of nasty old sandals and nothing to show for the $1,000 I had just spent. I didn't even know if I should report it to the police. Would they even take it seriously? It's not like they could just trace a random Craigslist scam, right? I mean, how could they find him? He'd vanished without a trace, and now I was left with this horrible feeling of being taken advantage of. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust anyone I meet online again. That experience changed the way I see people on Craigslist. People can pretend to be anyone, and they'll do whatever it takes to make a quick buck, even if it means taking advantage of someone like me. And now I'll never get back that $1,000 or the Jordans I thought I was going to have. Just a pair of old, disgusting sandals and a whole lot of regret. I'll be honest. I didn't think it would go down like this. Buying a used car on Craigslist seemed like a decent idea at the time. I was trying to get a good deal, trying to make my dream car, a BMW M3, a reality. Who wouldn't want a sleek, fast car like that for a fraction of the price? It seemed too good to be true, but I ignored that nagging little voice in my head and went ahead with it. It all started when I found the ad for the car. The listing was simple enough. BMW M3, 2013 model, excellent condition, 15,000 miles, $15,000 OBO. When I saw the price, I was like, no way. This is a scam. I mean, it was half the price of what the car was worth. But something about the listing felt right. The pictures were clear. The car looked immaculate. And the seller seemed pretty normal in our messages. A guy who just wanted to move on from his car for whatever reason. At first, I didn't even bother messaging him. I thought, yeah, sure, a car this good for that price. Not happening. But the listing kept sitting there and something made me take the plunge. I shot him a text saying I was interested. We met the next day in a parking lot near his place. He pulled up in the car and I couldn't believe how good it looked. I mean, the thing was spotless. It had that new car shine to it, even though it was a few years old. It had the kind of engine roar you dream of. Smooth, powerful, just waiting to be driven fast. We talked for a bit. He gave me the whole spiel about how he didn't have time for the car anymore. He was going through some personal stuff and just needed to sell it quick. His story checked out. I had no reason to doubt him. He even mentioned he'd recently gotten a new job and couldn't afford to keep the car anymore. The price was negotiable, and after some back and forth, I handed over $15,000. Thought I was getting a steal. I drove that car home like I was on top of the world. Honestly, I couldn't wipe the smile off my face the entire way back. The engine sounded incredible, and I was already thinking about how great it was going to be to take it out for a spin at night with the music blasting. Everything was fine for the first few hours. I parked it in my driveway, cleaned it up a bit, and just admired it. I couldn't believe I had an M3 sitting in my garage. But then, as night fell, things took a turn. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard the knock on my door. At first, I thought it was just some late night visitors or maybe a neighbor needing something, but I didn't think much of it. I opened the door and there were at least 4 police officers standing on my front porch. The guy in charge, who looked like he hadn't had a good night's sleep in a week, flashed his badge and told me they were there to seize my car. I stared at him, confused, thinking maybe it was some kind of mistake. I just bought the car. It was mine, right? But when I looked down the driveway, I saw that my M3 was surrounded by more officers, their flashlights shining out like it was some kind of crime scene. I felt this heavy pit in my stomach. What the hell was going on? The cop explained that the car was linked to a series of crimes, something about a stolen vehicle ring and fraud. Apparently, the car I had just bought was involved in some shady business, and the seller had been using it for illegal activities. They didn't give me too many details, but the more I tried to explain that I had just bought it, the more they kept saying it was out of my hands now. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't supposed to happen. I had just dropped all that money on a car I thought was legit. How could something like this be going on under my nose? They didn't even give me a chance to gather my thoughts. They told me they were confiscating the vehicle and I wouldn't be getting it back until the investigation was over. I asked them how this could happen. I gave them every bit of information I had on the seller, his name, number, the location where we met up, the text messages, the transaction details. The cops took down everything I had, but their expressions didn't change. It was like they were already convinced I was somehow part of whatever mess this was. The car was linked to something much bigger than just a simple Craigslist sale. As they loaded the car onto a tow truck, I stood there, frozen. I had no idea how deep this went. I tried calling the seller, but of course, his number was no longer in service. His Craigslist listing was gone too. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I went inside, still in shock, and tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the car. It was the fact that I had been pulled into something I never signed up for. I had no idea who this guy really was or what he was involved in. And now my name was probably going to be all over this investigation. I didn't know what to do next. I felt like I was in over my head, and I wasn't sure how I was going to get out of it. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't have any connections. I was just some guy who wanted a nice car for a good price. Days went by, and I kept trying to figure out what happened. I reached out to the cops a few times, but they gave me the same cold response. It's an ongoing investigation, and they couldn't release any further details. I asked if there was any way to get the car back, but they wouldn't budge. The whole thing had been tied up in legal red tape, and I had no say in the matter. I was left with nothing but a headache. I thought I had scored big with that M3, but instead, it turned into a nightmare. I never found out what exactly the seller was up to, but I'll tell you this. I'll never trust anything I find on Craigslist again. That car was a reminder that sometimes things that seem too good to be true really are. I never thought selling a PlayStation 4 would turn into a nightmare, but here I am, still trying to process what happened that day. If I had known how things were going to play out, I wouldn't just kept the damn console and avoided the whole mess. So, I put my PlayStation 4 up for sale on Craigslist. I wasn't using it anymore. It was just gathering dust on the shelf, and I needed some extra cash to help with bills. I just gotten it out of the closet when I snapped a few pictures and posted the ad. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a couple $100. It seemed like a good deal for anyone looking for a PlayStation 4 out of budget. I figured I'd get rid of it quickly. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. It didn't take long before I got a message from a guy named Kevin. He seemed interested, asked a couple of questions, and then agreed to come pick it up. He said he could meet at my place in a few hours. Perfect. I didn't even think twice about it. I cleared some space on the coffee table, got the console and the controllers all ready to go, and waited for him. When he showed up, I honestly didn't think anything was off at first. He looked pretty normal, maybe a little too average, if that makes sense. I mean, it wasn't like he was sketchy or anything, just, I don't know. There was something in the way he moved and the way he looked around that put me on edge. He walked in, looked around at my place, and gave it a quick scan. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like he was more focused on the room than the PlayStation. He kept glancing at the shelves, at the walls, even the plants. But it wasn't like he was admiring them. It felt like he was observing them, studying them. Then he saw the picture on the wall. It was a photo from my graduation day. I had it framed right next to the TV. You know, one of those classic proud apparent moments. It had me in my cap and gown, standing next to my family. I didn't think anything of it. It was a nice memory. But when Kevin saw it, his whole demeanor changed. His eyes lingered on the photo longer than anyone normally would. I noticed a little smirk forming on his face. It wasn't a friendly smirk, though. It was unsettling. He didn't say anything about it, but I could feel him staring, like he was studying my face in that picture, like he knew something I didn't. I asked him if he was ready to check out the PlayStation, and he snapped back to the present, but there was something different in his eyes now. He agreed, of course, but as I handed him the console, he made another weird comment about the room. He mentioned something about the layout, about the way the furniture was arranged, and how it looked like I'd put everything just so. At first, I didn't know how to respond. It was just my living room. I didn't think much of it, but then he kept going. He said things like, "Oh, I bet you spent a lot of time here, and I bet you've had a lot of good memories in this room." It felt like he was trying to dig deeper, but I couldn't figure out why. I'm not some super private person, but the way he was acting, I started getting uncomfortable. I brushed it off and handed him the PlayStation 4. He gave me the cash, $250, which was a little more than we agreed on. I didn't say anything. It wasn't a huge deal. He said I could keep the change, so I just put it in my pocket and smiled. But then, before he left, he stopped in front of the door and said, "You know, it's funny." I waited for him to continue, but he didn't. It wasn't like he was waiting for a response, either. He just stood there for a second, eyes on the floor, before turning and walking out the door. I felt a little unsettled, but figured I was just overthinking things. I mean, maybe I was just anxious about the weird vibes, but it wasn't anything I couldn't shake off. I grabbed the money, said goodbye, and closed the door behind him. Everything seemed fine, until I went to check the cash. I had a few errands to run, but when I finally had a moment to sit down, I started going through the money. I noticed right away that one of the bills fell off. It wasn't paper thin like a regular bill, and it had this weird texture to it. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I'd just gotten a fake bill, or maybe it was some weird collector's note or something. But then I flipped through the rest of the money, and it was all the same. Every single bill. It wasn't real money. It was all counterfeit. I couldn't believe it. I'd just been handed a pile of fake cash by some guy who'd walked out of my house like it was no big deal. I quickly checked my phone to see if he had texted or called me, but there was nothing. No messages, no missed calls. I immediately started freaking out. How had I been so stupid? I just handed him the console, and in return, he'd given me fake bills. But that wasn't even the worst part. What bothered me more was the feeling that came over me. The weird comments about my graduation photo, the odd remarks about the house, how he seemed to know so much. It felt like he was making some sort of mental map of my life, like he was trying to connect dots that didn't need connecting. It wasn't just about the money. I felt watched. And now that I was thinking about it, the way he looked at that photo, it wasn't just casual curiosity. It was like he recognized me from somewhere. I don't know what his deal was, but I'm telling you, I never saw that guy again. I blocked him on everything and reported the counterfeit money to the police, but they never got back to me. They probably figured it was a lost cause. I don't know if he was just some random scammer or if he had some kind of ulterior motive, but I'll never forget the way he made me feel. And I'll definitely never sell anything on Craigslist again. Something about that guy, the way he looked around my place, the way he talked, it wasn't right. I don't know if I'll ever truly know what he was after, but it left me with a sense of unease that I can't shake. Life's simple. You work, you sell stuff, you buy stuff, and you move on. So when I decided to sell my old car, a 2011 Honda Civic, I didn't think much of it. It was a decent car, nothing special, but I just didn't need it anymore. The whole process of putting it up on Craigslist felt like a typical transaction, just another day. I posted the ad on a Saturday morning with a picture of the car parked in my driveway. I wasn't expecting a ton of interest, but within an hour, my inbox was flooded with messages. Most of them were the usual lowball offers, but one guy stood out. His message was short, to the point. "I'll take it for the full asking price. Can come by today." I checked the profile. Seemed legit. No red flags. Just a simple profile with a few photos of him at what looked like car shows. All right, that's fine. I wasn't going to have much anyway. He told me he'd be there in a couple of hours. When he arrived, everything fell off. At first, it wasn't obvious, but as he pulled into my driveway, I got this weird gut feeling. He was driving a nondescript sedan, no tinted windows, no flashy rims, just a plain car. He parked it right in front of mine and got out. I couldn't even tell you what he looked like. He wasn't wearing anything strange, and he didn't say anything at first. He just got out, walked over to me, and handed me a wad of cash. No handshake, no hey, nice to meet you. Nothing. He just stood there holding the money out to me. I took it, counted it quickly, and then I handed him the keys. He didn't even check the car, didn't ask any questions. He didn't seem to care about the condition or the mileage. He just took the keys, got in, and drove off. His friend, who was dressed in the same clothes, drove the other car back. I thought it was a little weird, but at the same time, I figured he was just a no-nonsense guy. Maybe he was in a rush or just didn't care about the small talk. But as the day went on, that feeling of unease stuck with me. There was something strange about the whole encounter. Later that evening, I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I heard sirens outside. I looked out the window thinking it was just another police car speeding by, then I heard helicopters. I didn't think much of it until I turned on the news. There in front of the camera was a breaking story about a police chase. I froze when I saw the car in question. It was my car, the one I just sold. The news anchor reported that police had been chasing a vehicle for miles, and the suspects inside had opened fire at officers during the pursuit. The car was eventually boxed in and stopped, and the suspects were arrested after a standoff. The whole thing was chaotic, and they were showing clips of the car surrounded by police vehicles, officers with guns drawn, and the whole street in chaos. My heart sank. I sat there staring at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. There was no way it was a coincidence. The car was mine. I recognized the bumper sticker on the back. I recognized the little scratches on the side from when I accidentally scraped it against that stupid parking barrier. That was my car. My baby. I couldn't even begin to wrap my head around it. The guy I sold it to, the one who didn't speak, who just handed me the cash and left without a word, was involved in a shootout with the police, and I had just handed him the keys. I felt a cold sweat running down my back. I immediately called the police. I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't involved in whatever had happened, but I needed to know if I was in trouble. I explained the situation, told them about the sale, and mentioned that the guy had paid me in cash, which now seemed like an obvious red flag. But when the officer on the other end asked for details, I realized I didn't know a damn thing about the buyer. No name, no phone number, no address, not even a description of the guy. He never said a word other than handing me the money and leaving. I wasn't involved, right? I couldn't have been. I just sold the car. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe I was just overthinking it. After all, the money seemed fine when I took it. The guy seemed normal, if not a little odd. But my car was involved in a freaking shootout. The police asked if I kept any sort of records about the sale. Unfortunately, I hadn't. I didn't think I'd need them. It was just a straightforward transaction. They told me they'd like to be contacting me for more information, but that was the last I heard from them for a while. The next day, I kept watching the news, waiting for an update. I saw a few more reports about the chase, but they didn't release much detail about the suspects or what had actually happened. It just showed the car being towed away, along with shots of the suspects being arrested. I guess they weren't too concerned with the who at that point. They were more focused on the fact that there had been a shootout in the middle of a residential neighborhood. It took days before I got any official word from the police. They called me in for questioning, and that's when things got even stranger. I sat down with a detective, who looked at me like I was the one involved in whatever had happened. He asked me if I knew anything about the car's history, and I said no, I just sold it. He pressed me on why I didn't take more precautions with the sale, why I didn't ask for ID or make a formal bill of sale. I didn't have a good answer. All I could say was that I trusted the guy was legit, even though I couldn't really explain why. Like, how the hell am I supposed to know who the buyer is? I knew I wasn't in trouble, but I couldn't shake the suspicion that something more was going on. I had no idea who that guy was or what he was up to, but my car was now tied to a violent crime. The detective eventually let me go, but he told me to stay available in case they needed anything else. They never contacted me again. I couldn't help but wonder if they knew more than they were letting on. As for me, I've been paranoid ever since. I don't think I'll ever be able to sell anything on Craigslist again. I don't know if that guy had anything to do with the crime or if he was just a pawn in something bigger, but I'm still left with the thought of him showing up in my driveway, not saying a word, and leaving with my car. It's something I can't shake. Something about it just doesn't sit right. I've always loved getting things secondhand. There's just something about the treasure hunt. Finding cool things on Craigslist or at garage sales has always been my thing. A few weeks ago, I was looking for a new wardrobe. My old one was falling apart, and I just wanted something solid, maybe a little vintage, something with character. That's when I found a listing for this old wardrobe. It looked nice enough in the photos, a big dark wood piece, kind of like what you find in an old library or something. It was priced pretty cheap too, only about $200. I thought, why not? I messaged the seller, set up a time, and drove out to see it. It wasn't far, just about 15 minutes from my place. When I arrived, I was a little surprised. The place was a lot smaller than I expected, kind of a cramped little apartment on the second floor of a rundown building. It smelled weird too, like stale air and old books. The kind of smell that makes you wonder how long someone's been living in a place. The guy who opened the door looked normal. A little older than me, maybe in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and kind of a wild look in his eyes. He was wearing a faded t-shirt, cargo pants, and had a weird, intense look about him. But I didn't think much of it. Some people just had that vibe, right? I wasn't about to judge someone for looking a little eccentric. He led me to the wardrobe, which was in the corner of a small living room. It looked perfect, just like in the pictures. Big, solid, made of dark oak with brass handles. It was heavy, solid, and honestly, I could tell it was built well. I could use something like this to replace my old, falling-apart dresser. He mentioned he was moving soon and needed to get rid of it, which seemed fair enough. I didn't haggle on the price. I handed him the cash, he handed me the keys to the wardrobe, and I was about to leave when he made this strange comment. "Just don't open it too fast, okay," he said. His voice was almost a whisper, and he was staring at the wardrobe like it was something more than just furniture. It was such a weird thing to say, but I just nodded, thinking it was some kind of weird, quirky thing he said for no reason. People have strange habits, right? I didn't think much about it. I loaded the wardrobe into my car, said goodbye, and went home. It wasn't until later that night that I noticed something odd. I had been planning to put the wardrobe in my bedroom, so I started to set it up. The thing was heavy, way heavier than I'd expected. It took a while to get it upright, but once it was in place, I started going through the drawers, just to see if it had any extra features or compartments. That's when I found it. I pulled on one of the bottom drawers, and it didn't open right away. It felt like something was blocking it. I gave it another tug, and suddenly the drawer popped open with a loud crack. And that's when I saw it. At first, I didn't get it. It looked like monkey costumes. They were shoved inside the compartment, rolled up and crammed into the corner. But what really freaked me out was that the mouths of the costumes were covered in something dark, like dried blood. It was all over the fabric, staining the little stitched teeth in a way that made me sick to my stomach. I froze for a second. My mind went blank. Why would anyone hide monkey costumes in a wardrobe? And why were they stained with blood? I didn't know what to think. I had that feeling in my gut, the one you get when you know something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. I pulled one of the costumes out carefully. The fabric was rough, and it smelt sour, like something had been sitting there for years. The blood stains were dried, but they didn't look like they were from any kind of animal. This wasn't like some fake movie blood or stage props. The stains were deep and real. I thought about calling the cops right then, but I didn't know what to say. What would I even tell them? That I bought a wardrobe from some guy on Craigslist and found creepy, blood-stained monkey costumes inside. How would they take that seriously? I left the wardrobe where it was for the rest of the night. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the guy who sold it to me. What was he thinking when he sold me that wardrobe? Did he know what was inside? Why the monkey costumes? And the blood? That had to be real. Why would someone hide something like that? I spent the next day thinking about it all. I tried to forget about the whole thing, but I couldn't shake the thought of those costumes. What if the guy was some kind of weird collector or something? Maybe he used them for some twisted hobby, and I had just bought something that was part of whatever weird world he lived in. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I needed to get rid of the wardrobe. I didn't want to keep something so strange, so unsettling, but I couldn't just throw it away. It was still a beautiful piece of furniture, despite the weirdness inside. So I decided to go back to the apartment where I bought it. Maybe I could get some answers. Maybe I was just overreacting. I didn't know what I expected, but I figured it was worth a shot. When I got there, the building looked even more run down than I remembered. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the whole place just felt empty, like no one had lived there in years. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I knocked again, then a third time, but still nothing. I stood there for a while, wondering what to do. That's when I noticed something strange. The door had a strange, almost fresh, smudge of red on the handle. It was faint, but it was there. I stood there for a second, just staring at it, and I felt my stomach twist. My heart started racing, and for the first time, I felt like I needed to get out of there. I went back to my car, still holding the creepy monkey costumes in my hands. I threw them in the trunk and drove away, leaving the building behind. I couldn't get rid of the image of the red smudge on the door, and the thought of the blood on those costumes haunted me. What the hell had I gotten myself into? I don't know what happened to the guy who sold me a wardrobe, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never buying anything from Craigslist again. Not ever. I don't care how big the deal is. That wardrobe and those costumes are gone, but I still get the feeling that I haven't seen the last of whatever dark secret that guy was hiding. I never thought that looking for a roommate on Craigslist would lead to something like this, but here we are. I've been living in my apartment for a while, and as much as I enjoyed my privacy, I could barely afford the rent on my own. So I decided to post an ad for a roommate. I was hoping to find someone chill, someone who just needed a place to crash, paid their share of the rent, and didn't have any weird habits. That's when Diane responded. At first, I thought she was fine. She seemed normal enough when we met. Early 30s, dressed pretty casually with long dark hair and a calm demeanor. She told me she worked as a graphic designer, which seemed like a solid job, and she didn't really have any crazy stories to tell. I could tell she was a little shy, but that was fine with me. It's not like I was expecting someone to move in and start throwing parties every weekend. She checked out the apartment, asked a few questions about the place, then seemed to really like it. I was glad because I was getting pretty tired of living alone. She agreed to move the next week, and we both shook on it. There were no red flags, no weird vibes. Everything seemed like it was going to work out fine. She moved in a few days later, and at first, things were totally normal. She kept to herself mostly, came home late some nights, usually after a long day at work. I didn't mind, I was used to it. We didn't hang out much, but we'd chat here and there when we crossed paths. It felt like a peaceful living situation, the kind I was hoping for. But that all changed one night. I was lying in bed and trying to sleep when I heard something from down the hall. It wasn't anything loud at first, just a weird sound coming from Diana's room. It was like a soft shuffle, then some faint whispers. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe she was just getting up for something, but then it went on for a while, like at least 30 minutes of rustling and weird sounds. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I was tired and just wanted to sleep, so I knocked on her door to check if everything was okay. I didn't get a response. I knocked again, and this time the sound stopped abruptly. It was like someone hit pause on whatever was going on in there. Still, Diana didn't open the door, so I assumed she was just asleep or maybe busy with something. The next morning, we bumped into each other in the kitchen. I wasn't sure how to bring it up, but I figured I should ask just in case she was dealing with something strange. So I casually asked her about it, the noises and the weirdness the night before. She seemed confused, almost startled. She told me she had been asleep the whole time and hadn't even heard anything. I let it go. Maybe I had just imagined it, or maybe I was just hearing things. But then the weird stuff started happening more often. A couple of nights later, it happened again. That same shuffling sound, like something was moving around in her room, but this time there was also a soft, almost sing-songy voice mixed in. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. I was about to go check again, but I froze. I realized that the last time I had knocked, Diana stopped whatever she was doing, and I didn't want to make her uncomfortable. Maybe she was just a night owl or had some quirky habits. Maybe I was overthinking it. The next day, I was feeling pretty unsettled. I couldn't get the sounds out of my head. I figured I'd drop it and let it go for now, but then something happened that made me second-guess everything. Diana left for work that day, and I was alone in the apartment. I walked past her room and noticed that her door was cracked open just a little. Normally, she closed it all the way when she left, but today it was wide enough for me to see inside. Out of curiosity, I walked past it, and that's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. The walls of her room were covered in strange, disturbing drawings. They were all over the place on the walls, the door, even on the back of the dresser. Some of them looked like weird symbols, others like demonic faces. But the ones that really got to me were the drawings of people hanging, like nooses around their necks, their eyes wide open. It felt like something I shouldn't have seen. I quickly walked away from her room, my heart racing. My mind was spinning with questions. Why was she drawing this stuff? Was she into some kind of weird occult thing? Why was she hiding it in her room? I couldn't just ignore it. I had to confront her, but I didn't want to make a scene or freak her out. I'd already been uneasy about her the night before, and now this. It didn't sit right with me at all. Later that afternoon, I called her. I told her that I needed to talk, and when she came home, I told her I had seen the drawings on the walls. I asked her about it, what they meant. At first, she just looked at me blankly. Then she said something that didn't help at all. She said she had no idea what I was talking about. She said she hadn't drawn anything on the walls and that I must have been mistaken. But I knew I wasn't wrong. I had seen them. I knew what I had seen. There was no denying it. I told her I couldn't live with someone who was doing whatever that was. I didn't feel safe anymore. I told her she had to leave. The next day, she packed up her things and left, but it didn't feel like it was over. There was something off about the whole situation, and even now I still wonder what Diana was really up to. I haven't had a roommate since. I can't bring myself to even consider it. That whole situation left me feeling like I was being watched, like I had missed something important. I don't know if I'll ever know what Diana was really doing in that room, but I know for sure I'm never taking another roommate again. Some things, I guess, are better left unknown. The guy selling it lived in a small, run-down house on the edge of town. The kind of place where the grass grows too high, and there's always a single porch light flickering even though it's the middle of the day. I pulled up, sent a quick text, and he walked out carrying it before I even got out of the car. It looked fine, white, a little scuff on the sides, but nothing crazy. He barely said a word, just handed it off, took the cash, and went back inside before I could even ask if it worked. I drove home with it in the passenger seat, feeling kind of weird about the whole thing. I told myself I was overthinking it. People on Craigslist are awkward. That's normal. I got home, cleared a spot on the counter, and plugged it in. It lit up, numbers blinking on the screen. I grabbed a leftover slice of pizza, tossed it inside, and set it for 30 seconds. It hummed to life, spinning the pizza in slow circles. And it started making this sound. Not the usual microwave sound. This was off. A low, sputtering crackle like something inside was short-circuiting. I leaned in closer, watching the pizza turn under the dim yellow light. The hum got louder, a buzzing, almost like static from a TV with no signal. I probably should have stopped it, but I didn't. Then the whole thing exploded. It wasn't like in movies where there's a big fireball or anything. It was more like a small, controlled detonation. The door blasted open, metal hinges snapping like twigs. The glass shattered outward, tiny shards flying across the kitchen. A thick, acrid smoke poured out, filling the room instantly. My ears rang so loud I thought I went deaf for a second. I backed up fast, heart slamming in my chest. My hands were shaking, my shirt peppered with tiny specks of glass. The pizza was gone. Just gone. I stared at the microwave, smoke still curling from its vents, and my stomach dropped. There was something inside it. Not food. Not wires or metal. Something was wedged in the back, barely visible past the melted plastic and twisted metal. I grabbed a dish towel, wrapped it around my hand, and reached in. It was hot, almost burning my fingers through the fabric, but I managed to pull it out. It was a phone. An old flip phone, half melted, screen cracked, but still vaguely recognizable. I turned it over, my breath catching in my throat. The back cover had been pried off, and the battery was missing. There were wires connected to where it should have been. That's what hit me. This thing wasn't broken. It was rigged. I dropped it onto the counter like it burned me. My mind raced. Someone had wired a phone into the microwave. But why? I looked back at the machine, trying to piece it together. The explosion. It wasn't random. It was a trigger. The second I turned it on, the phone must have sent a charge through the system, setting off something. Some kind of small explosive, maybe. I didn't know much about that kind of thing, but it sure as hell wasn't normal. I grabbed my car keys, and still shaking, and bolted out of the house. I needed answers. I drove straight back to the guy's place, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I had so many questions, but mostly, I just wanted to know what the hell I had almost brought into my house. His house looked the same as before, dead grass, flickering porch light. I pounded on the door, my heartbeat a drum in my ears. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. I grabbed the doorknob on impulse, and to my surprise, it twisted easily. The door creaked open. My stomach knotted. I should have turned around right then. Should have just gone home and called the cops. But I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. That thick, musty scent of a place that's been abandoned too long. The air felt heavy, like it hadn't been touched in years. I took a slow step forward, eyes adjusting to the dim light. The furniture was still there. A couch, a coffee table, a small TV, but everything was covered in dust. And that's when I saw them. Microwaves. Lined up against the wall, stacked on top of each other, all different sizes and brands. Some looked new, others old and rusted. My stomach turned as I stepped closer. Every single one had something inside. Phones, small circuit boards, strange wires looping around the interiors like veins. I turned ready to bolt when I noticed a notebook on the coffee table. It was open. Pages filled with messy, cramped handwriting. I picked it up, my fingers leaving prints in the thick layer of dust. The words barely made sense, ramblings about waves and frequencies. Numbers I didn't understand. But then, near the bottom of one page, a sentence stood out. They hear us through the static. I didn't stick around to read the rest. I dropped the notebook, ran back to my car, and sped home so fast I barely stopped at red lights. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't even go back into the kitchen. The microwave sat there, broken and smoking like a dead thing. I kept staring at it, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, I took it to the dump, tossed it into the pile of scrap metal, and didn't look back. I tried searching for the Craigslist listing again, but it was gone. No trace of it, like it never existed. I even drove past that guy's house a few days later, but it was empty. The front door was open, swinging slightly in the wind, and the porch light was finally off. I don't know what the hell is going on in that house, and I don't want to. I just know I'll never buy anything off Craigslist again. I was just trying to sell a bike. That's it. I wasn't looking for trouble, didn't expect anything weird, just wanted to make a quick $50 and be done with it. The bike wasn't even that nice, just an old mountain bike I had sitting in the garage. A little rust on the chain. Tires still good, brakes kind of squeaky, but whatever. It worked. I threw it up on Craigslist, and within a few hours, I got a message from some guy named Jake. Said he wanted to buy it that night. I should have known something was off. First, he insisted on meeting in an empty parking lot. Not like a grocery store or something normal, but this old, half-abandoned strip mall on the edge of town. One of those places where only one or two stores are still open, and everything else is just boarded up windows and faded signs. But I figured whatever. Public enough. I loaded the bike into the back of my car and drove out there around 9 p.m. It was one of those weird nights where the air felt thick, like it was about to storm, but never actually did. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars scattered around. I pulled into a spot near one of the flickering streetlights and waited. After a couple of minutes, this guy walked up from the sidewalk. Skinny dude, hoodie pulled up, hands in his pockets. Looked a little sketchy, but I'd met weird people through Craigslist before, so I didn't think much of it. He barely even looked at the bike, just kind of circled around it like he was stalling for time. Then he reached into his hoodie and my stomach sank. I knew it was coming before he even pulled it out. A gun. I should have been scared. That's the normal reaction, right? Someone points a gun at you, you freeze up, panic, do whatever they say. But the second I saw it, something in my brain just clicked. It was fake. I don't know how I knew. Maybe it was the way he held it too loose, like he'd never even touched a real one before. Maybe it was the weight. It just looked too light. Plasticky. He was trying too hard to be intimidating, shoulders all stiff, voice low like he was in some crime movie. And instead of freaking out, I just laughed. It just came out, This loud, uncontrollable laugh that echoed across the empty parking lot. His face dropped. I think it took him a second to process what was happening because he just stood there, blinking, fake gun still pointed at me. That's when I stepped forward. Not ran, not lunged, just took a slow step toward him. He panicked. His hands started shaking, and before I could even say anything, he turned and bolted. Just full on sprinted in the opposite direction, like a cartoon character or something. And for some reason I chased him. I don't even know why. Instinct, maybe. I wasn't thinking. My leg just moved, and suddenly I was running after this dude through an empty parking lot, past rows of dark storefronts. He kept glancing back, probably realizing how bad he screwed up. I could hear his breathing getting all ragged. He wasn't fast. I was gaining on him. He veered toward an alley behind the strip mall, trying to lose me. I followed without even hesitating. The second I turned the corner, I saw him trip over a pile of trash bags, crashing hard into the pavement. I stopped a few feet away, watching as he scrambled back up, hoodie slipping off his head. He wasn't even that old. Maybe a couple of years older than me, early 20s at most. He had this wild, desperate look in his eyes, like he was expecting me to beat the hell out of him or something. I just stood there, catching my breath. He didn't say anything, just gave me this weird, confused look like he couldn't believe I hadn't left yet. Then, without another word, he turned and ran again, disappearing around the corner. I didn't follow this time. I walked back to my car, heart still pounding. The bike was still there, leaning against the streetlight where I left it. I tossed it back into my trunk and drove home, still trying to wrap my head around what just happened. The whole thing felt surreal, like some kind of messed up fever dream. The next morning, I checked Craigslist again. The guy's profile was gone. No messages, no listing history, nothing. It was like he never existed. I never reported it. Never told anyone. I just deleted my Craigslist post and decided to keep the bike. I finally got my dream bike. A Honda Cigar 500. Not brand new, not even close, but to me it was perfect. I've been saving up for months, scrolling through listings every night, waiting for the right one. Then I found it. Some guy a couple of towns over was selling one for cheap, way cheaper than it should have been. Said he was moving, needed a gun fast. That should have been a red flag, but when you're staring at pictures of a bike you've wanted for years, logic kind of takes a backseat. I messaged him and we set up a time to meet that evening. He lived in this sketchy part of town, way out past the main streets where the streetlights barely worked. His house was this small, beat-up place with a dirt driveway and a bunch of random car parts scattered around the yard. He came out as soon as I pulled up, already rolling the bike toward me. It looked even better in person. Matte black, no major scratches, everything clean. He said he barely rode it, just used it to get to work sometimes. That didn't make much sense to me. Why would someone buy a bike like this and barely ride it? But again, I wasn't thinking straight. I handed over the cash. He gave me the key, signed some half-crumpled title paper, and that was it. I was officially a bike owner. The ride home was perfect. The engine purred under me, the cool night air rushing past. I felt invincible, like I was finally in the club, part of something bigger. When I pulled into my driveway, I just sat there for a minute, listening to the ticking sound of the engine cooling down. Then I locked it up, put the cover over it, and went inside. I went to bed thinking about all the rides I was gonna take. The next morning, the bike was gone. I walked outside, coffee in hand, ready to take it for another spin, and just stopped. The cover was on the ground. The lock? Gone. The space where the bike should have been, completely empty. I stood there, brain short-circuiting. I knew I locked it. I triple-checked before I went to bed. My neighborhood wasn't bad, but still, I wasn't stupid. I even had one of those disc locks on the front wheel. But none of that mattered. Someone had stolen it. I ran back inside, grabbed my phone, and went straight to the hidden camera I had set up above my driveway. It was one of those cheap ones, motion-activated, mostly for catching stray cats knocking over my trash cans. I never actually expected to use it for something serious. But there it was 2:37 a.m. A figure walking up my driveway. I hit play, already feeling sick. The guy was wearing a hoodie moving fast like he already knew exactly where the bike was. He reached down, yanked the cover off, and my stomach dropped. I recognized him. It was the seller, the same guy who sold me the bike just hours earlier. I watched as he pulled something from his pocket, probably a spare key. He crouched next to the front wheel, doing something I couldn't see, and then, just like that, he swung his leg over and rode off, like it was nothing, like he was just taking his own bike for a casual midnight ride. I just stood there, watching the screen, feeling like an idiot. He planned this. The price was too good because he never intended to actually sell it. He had a spare key, knew exactly where I lived, and just waited until I was asleep to come and take it back. Probably figured I'd report it stolen and move on, leaving him with both my money and the bike. I wanted to throw my phone at the wall. I wasn't even mad at him. I was mad at myself. Mad for not questioning why he was selling it so cheap. Mad for not checking if there were extra keys. Mad for being so excited about finally getting the bike that I ignored every single red flag. I didn't go to the cops. I already knew how that would go. Yeah, I had the video, but I also bought the bike off Craigslist with no real paperwork. Just a handwritten title and a guy who, for all I knew, didn't even use his real name. He'd be long gone before they did anything. I checked Craigslist again, just in case. Maybe he was dumb enough to list it again. Nothing. But I wasn't letting this go. I went back to his place that night. Not to confront him. I wasn't that stupid. I just wanted to see if he was still around. The house looked the same. Dark, rundown, empty. No bike in sight. No cars, no lights, nothing. I sat in my car down the street for almost an hour, waiting to see if anyone came or went. Nobody did. It was like he just vanished. I drove home, feeling even worse than before. I wasn't getting the bike back. That much was obvious. The money. Gone. The guy. Gone. And there was nothing I could do about it. I didn't tell anyone. Didn't even mention it to my friends. It was too embarrassing. I just deleted the listing from my phone and tried to pretend it never happened. I didn't think Craigslist could ever lead to something creepy, let alone terrifying. The weirdest thing I'd ever sold before were a couple of broken speakers I found in my garage, and I got a good deal out of that. So when I decided to list my old baseball card collection, I figured it'd be just another regular transaction. Maybe a little haggling, but no big deal, right? I was wrong. It all started one night when I was cleaning out the attic. I found a shoebox crammed with baseball cards, ones I collected when I was a kid. Some of them were worth a decent amount of money, or at least I thought they were. The old ones, the ones from the 80s and 90s, were starting to pick up value. I knew they weren't worth a fortune, but I figured I could maybe make a few $100 off them. I hadn't really looked at them in years, but they were taking up space, so I snapped some pictures and posted an ad on Craigslist. The next morning, I already had messages flooding in. Some were from people who were clearly looking to bargain, trying to talk me down from the $300 price tag I put on the lot. One message, though, stood out. It was a short one, just 3 words. I'll take them. No question. No lobbling. Just that. I was a bit curious, but figured the guy was just eager to get his hands on them. Maybe he didn't know what he was buying. Maybe he just wanted a deal. Who knows? I responded, set up a time for him to come by, and hoped this would be an easy sell. The guy showed up later that afternoon. Tall, probably mid-40s, wearing a weathered leather jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. He didn't exactly seem like the kind of person I expected to be into baseball cards, but I shrugged it off. People had all sorts of hobbies, right? He walked in without so much as a hello, just a quick nod when I gestured for him to sit. I gave him the box of cards, and he immediately started sorting through them. There was a weird silence that filled the room, like he wasn't just looking at cards, but inspecting something else. He was meticulous, too meticulous almost. I had priced the cards at $300, which was pretty fair considering some of the more valuable ones in the collection. But after a few minutes of flipping through the cards, he looked up and said, "I'll take them for $50." I almost laughed. I wasn't about to let them go for that little, especially not when I knew the worth of some of the cards in the box. "No," I said, "I'm firm on the price. $300 is what I'm asking." He didn't argue. He just looked at me for a second like he was sizing me up. Then he said something that threw me off completely. "I'll be back. You'll have the next 24 hours to think it over. Enjoy the time." I didn't know what to make of it. It was a weird thing to say, but I figured maybe he just wanted to leave and come back with more cash. Whenever. I told him the cars weren't going anywhere, and if he wanted them, we'd talk tomorrow. The guy left, and I thought that would be the end of it. I went about my day, figuring I'd just go about my normal routine. But as the hours passed, I started feeling strange. It wasn't like anything I could put my finger on, just this uncomfortable weight hanging over me like someone was watching me. I kept glancing out the window, checking my phone for messages that never came, and doing my best to ignore the weird tension building inside me. As night fell, it started to get worse. It wasn't like paranoia or anything. At least, that's how I tried to tell myself it wasn't. It was more a feeling that someone had planted themselves in the space just outside my vision, always there but never fully visible. I went to bed that night, but I didn't sleep well. Every sound, every creak of the house made me bolt upright in bed, wide-eyed, waiting for something to happen. It wasn't like I had a bad feeling about the guy, just that everything about the situation seemed wrong. The next day, I woke up to an email from the guy. Just a simple message saying, "I'll be there soon. I'll give you $50. I figured this was probably my cue to either get the cards sold or cut my losses. I wasn't really in a rush, but after what had happened the night before, I felt like I needed to wrap this up. I replied, telling him to come by, but part of me wanted to back out and just cancel the deal. It didn't feel right, but the idea of not getting paid for the cards felt worse. I'd made the deal, I had to follow through, right? When he showed up again, it was the same odd vibe. He barely looked at me as he came in, eyes locked on the box of cards, his hands moving quickly over the cards, flipping through them like he was searching for something. I offered him the $300 deal again, but this time he didn't even try to haggle. He just nodded, accepted the price, and said, "I'll take them now." I handed him the box. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, and handed it to me. At first, I thought maybe he just miscounted, but then he made it clear that's all he was giving me. I stood there, trying to figure out if I was going to let this slide or what. But as I looked at him, I could feel that same weird pressure building up in the room. The silence seemed thicker somehow, heavier, like he was waiting for something else. I asked him if he had the rest of the money, but he just stared at me with those dead eyes and said nothing. That's when I felt it. The thing I hadn't noticed before, the thing that was there the whole time. There was something off about this guy, something twisted. Then, without saying another word, he turned around and walked out. The door shut behind him with a soft click. I stood there for a moment, my hand still gripping the $50 bill he left behind, not sure what to make of it all. The next 24 hours passed with an oppressive weight hanging over me, like I was waiting for something horrible to happen, something inevitable. I didn't hear from him again. I didn't need to. The whole thing had left me on edge, something I might not be able to get rid of. I don't know what that guy wanted or if he even wanted the cards at all. But I do know that I haven't felt the same since. I keep checking my locks, I keep checking the windows, and I can't shake the thought that I'll see him again. I can't shake the thought that one day I'll have to pay for what happened that night. I've made some questionable decisions in my life, but this one takes the cake. It all started when I was looking for some new socks. Yeah, I know, socks. Not the most exciting thing to shop for, but they're a necessity, right? So I'm scrolling through Craigslist one night, half watching a show, and I stumble across this ad that catches my eye. It was titled, "Brand New Socks, Wholesale Prices." The description sounded pretty legit. They were selling socks in bulk, and the price seemed way too good to pass up. I'd been meaning to buy some new ones for a while, and I figured why not get them cheap. Now, I didn't think too much about it at first. I mean, I wasn't expecting to buy socks from a high-end store, but this was Craigslist, so whatever. People sell weird stuff on there all the time. What was the worst that could happen, right? I clicked on the listing, and sure enough, there was a guy offering various types of socks. Athletic, cotton, wool, all in bulk. I shot him a quick message asking for more details, and he replied fast. He said he was a wholesaler and could ship directly to me for a small shipping fee. He even promised the socks would be brand new, straight from the warehouse. To be honest, I was excited. I could finally toss out those mismatched, hole-ridden socks I had been wearing for way too long. So I paid for the socks, including shipping, and then waited. I didn't think about it much while I waited. My mind was on other things like the usual random stuff. School, work, whatever. About a week later, I got a package in the mail. It wasn't huge, but it was heavy. I ripped open the package without even thinking, eager to see what I'd get. But what I found inside made my stomach drop. It wasn't the socks I was expecting. Instead, there were several pairs of used socks, dirty socks with signs of wear, stains that looked like they had been worn for weeks. I felt a cold rush of panic hit me, but that wasn't even the worst part. Underneath the pile of socks, I found a pair of underwear, women's underwear, and on top of everything there was a note tucked inside, written in messy handwriting. The note just said, "Wear them for me." I sat there staring at it, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. I didn't know what to think. I was frozen, holding the underwear in my hands, not knowing if I was going to puke or scream. It felt like I was in some kind of sick nightmare. Who does this? Why would someone do this? I instantly pulled up the ad again on Craigslist, but it was gone. The listing was taken down. It was like it never existed. My heart was pounding as I stared at the empty page. I tried to search for the seller's profile, but he had vanished too. No contact info, no trace of anything. Just gone. I started to feel the weight of what had happened sink in, and I had this overwhelming urge to get rid of the package. Burn it, throw it out, anything to make it disappear. But I didn't. I don't even know why. Maybe I was too stunned to do anything rational, or maybe I just thought if I ignored it, it would go away. But it didn't. The unease started to grow. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and every time I looked at those socks, I felt a creeping sense of dread. I started noticing things about the package that I hadn't before. The socks, they didn't smell like fresh laundry. They had this distinct, musty odor. The underwear wasn't just thrown in there. It was folded carefully, almost like it was waiting for me. At this point, I realized I had made a huge mistake. I should have reported it, or at least contacted someone, but I didn't. I didn't know who to contact, and honestly, I didn't even know if anyone would believe me. I started to second-guess everything. Was I being paranoid? Was it all in my head? But then the strange messages started. It was a few days after I received the package. I didn't touch it. I kept it in my room, shoved in the back of my closet, where I hoped I could forget about it, but that didn't happen. I began getting texts from a number I didn't recognize. The first one was simple enough. "Do you enjoy the socks?" I stared at the message, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't block the number fast enough. The messages kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. They knew where I lived. They knew what I looked like. That you'd mentioned things about my life that they shouldn't have known. I was completely freaked out, and I had no idea who this person was or why they were doing this. Then the worst message came. It was just a photo of me from outside my apartment. It wasn't a clear shot, but it was unmistakably me. I immediately ran to my window and checked outside. Nothing. The whole situation felt unreal. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if something truly horrible was happening. Every time I looked at my phone, there was another message, another detail that sent my heart racing. It was like they were getting closer. I did what I could to protect myself after that, changed all my social media privacy settings, made my accounts private, and even started to watch my back when I went outside. But it didn't help. The weird messages kept coming. The last one was the most unsettling. "I know you'll wear them soon. I'm waiting." I've never felt more trapped in my life. The socks, the underwear, the note, it wasn't just a creepy prank anymore. It was something darker, something that made my skin crawl. Whoever was behind this had been watching me, knew my routines, and had clearly planned all of it. To this day, I don't know who that person was or what they wanted. I've moved since then, changed my number, tried to bury it all, but every so often, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, wondering if I'll ever get a message again, wondering if they're still watching. I wish I had never bought those socks. You know how people always say Craigslist is full of weird stuff? Well, I learned it the hard way. I didn't think much of it when I posted an old TV my dad told me to get rid of. It was one of those old boxy TVs that probably hadn't been used in years. We bought a new flat screen, and the old one was just sitting there, taking up space in the basement. My dad didn't want to deal with it, so he told me to sell it. "It's taking up room, get rid of it," he said. No big deal, right? So I put it up on Craigslist for a measly $100. That seemed fair. I wasn't expecting anyone to get all excited over it, but I figured someone would want it for cheap. Maybe someone who was into retro stuff or needed a spare TV for their garage. But what happened next? That was the last thing I ever could have imagined. I didn't expect much at first, but the very next day I got a message. It was a short one, barely any details, just, "I'll take it. $1,000. Can I have someone pick it up?" I stared at the screen, thinking it was some kind of joke. No way was someone going to offer $1,000 for an old TV like that. I mean, it was big, heavy, and honestly, probably outdated by now. I figured the guy was just messing with me. But then he sent another message. "I'm serious. I'll pay $1,000. I'll have someone collect it from your address." I thought this was definitely a scam. $1,000 for a junky old TV. That was insane. I was about to ignore it and block the guy when something told me to at least follow up. I mean, $1,000 is $1,000, right? So I asked him if he was serious. He replied almost immediately, "Yes. Please send your address. I'll send someone over." At this point, I was kind of intrigued. I even called my dad to ask if he thought it was worth it. And he said, "If someone's willing to pay that much for an old TV, take it." So I sent the address and waited. The next day, I got up like normal and went about my day, not thinking much about it anymore. By noon, I had totally forgotten about the whole thing, until I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I figured it was just a neighbor or something. But when I opened the door, I froze. There were 12 men standing there, all in black suits. I remember feeling my heart race because something about the whole scene felt off. It didn't make any sense. Who were these guys? Why did they all look so serious? They weren't holding anything, just standing in a straight line, like they were waiting for something. It felt like a movie scene, and I couldn't wrap my head around what was happening. One of them stepped forward, his face expressionless. He didn't say anything at first, just handed me a black briefcase. I stared at the briefcase, confused and uneasy, and took it without really thinking. My hands were shaking by this point. I wanted to ask questions, but something in the air told me not to. Without saying a word, the men just walked past me and went straight to the basement door. It didn't even ask where the TV was. They just knew. They went down into the basement, and I heard the sound of them carefully lifting the TV and bringing it upstairs. It was like they had done this 100 times before. The whole thing was surreal. When they came back upstairs, they had the TV in their hands. No hesitation. They didn't even glance at me, just walked out the door and toward a black van that was parked in front of my house. The whole thing happened so fast. 1 minute they were in my house, and the next they were loading the TV into the van and driving off. And there I was, holding the briefcase, still trying to process what had just happened. I felt sick to my stomach. I had no idea what just went down. They were so precise. It wasn't like any normal transaction. The way they moved, the way they didn't speak a word, it felt rehearsed, like they had done this before. But why? Why were they so interested in a broken down old TV? I stood there for a minute just staring at the briefcase in my hands before slowly closing the door. My mind was racing. I sat down in the living room, still holding it, not knowing what to do. I had been given $1,000, but I wasn't sure I wanted it. It felt wrong. It felt like I was part of something I wasn't supposed to be. I opened the briefcase and found the money, $1,000, all in cash in neat stacks. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. My first thought was to call the police, then I thought about it for a second longer. What would I even say? "Hey, these guys came and took my old TV, but they gave me $1,000. Can you check it out?" It sounded ridiculous. The whole situation was ridiculous. So I didn't call anyone. Instead, I put the briefcase on the table and sat there staring at the cash. I tried to push the thoughts of the men in suits out of my mind, but it was hard. They had been so official. Everything about the way they moved, the way they took the TV, it felt so planned, like they were part of something bigger than just a random Craigslist transaction. The rest of the day felt strange, like I was waiting for something. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely scared in my own house. The silence was oppressive, like something was lurking just outside my door, waiting for me to make a move. I kept thinking about the TV, why they wanted it, and why they paid so much for it. It wasn't until later that night when I finally decided to leave the house for a while, just to clear my head. I didn't feel safe anymore, not knowing who those men were or what their real intentions had been. I left the briefcase at home, but as I stepped out the door, I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching me. I still have the money, but I don't know if I'll ever feel right about it. And I'll never forget the way they moved, the way they took that TV without a word. Something about it all doesn't sit right with me. I still don't know what made me do it. Maybe I was bored, or maybe it was just a stupid joke gone wrong. But somehow, what started as a dumb comment on Craigslist turned into one of the most messed up things that's ever happened to me. It all started one afternoon when I was scrolling through Craigslist, like I usually do when I'm killing time. There's always some weird stuff on there, but this one listing caught my eye. It was simple, just a few words. Ants for sale. There wasn't much to it. Just a guy saying he had ants for sale, and that they were quality ants, perfect for any needs. I didn't even think about it at first. I honestly thought it was just some weird ad or maybe even a prank. But then I did something dumb. I clicked on the listing, and without really thinking, I left a comment. It was meant to be a joke, just something to mess with the guy. I said, "I want 10,000 ants, please." I thought that was the end of it. I didn't expect anyone to take me seriously. But of course, this is Craigslist we're talking about, and people do weird things on there. The next day, I got a response. At first, I thought it was just someone trolling me back, but it wasn't. It was the guy who had posted the ad. He said something like, "You got it. 10,000 ants coming your way, friend. Enjoy." I thought he was just playing along, but when I looked at his profile, it didn't seem like a joke. This guy was serious. I laughed it off. Who would actually send someone 10,000 ants? I figured he was just messing around, and that would be the last I heard from him. I didn't give it another thought. But then, a couple of days later, I got a package in the mail. It didn't even click in my head at first what it was. I figured it was just a random delivery, maybe something I'd forgotten about. When I opened it, that's when everything went sideways. The box was small but heavy, and when I opened it up, my stomach dropped. Inside was a plastic container, the kind you might keep pet insects in. But what was inside was way worse than anything I could have imagined. There, crawling in a pile at the bottom, was a seed of ants, thousands of them. I couldn't even count how many there were, but it was a lot. At first, I just stared at it, frozen. There was a note on top of the container, and when I picked it up, I saw what it said. "This one is on the house, or rather, in the house." I could feel my pulse start to race as my mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. The ants were moving around in the box, and suddenly, the idea that these tiny creatures could be crawling all over me seemed terrifying. I stood there, holding the box, and then I made the mistake of opening it. The ants flooded out. It was like something from a nightmare. They poured out of the box in waves, crawling up my arms, my legs, and across the floor. It was an endless flood of them, and it felt like they were everywhere. I started screaming, but it didn't help. The more I tried to brush them off, the more they kept coming. It wasn't like a handful of ants you might find in your kitchen. No, this was a full-on invasion. I ran out of the room trying to get away from the swarm that had filled every corner of my living room. But the more I ran, the more I realized I couldn't escape them. They were under my clothes, inside my shoes, and my hair. I could feel them crawling into places I couldn't reach, and it was the most disgusting thing I've ever felt in my life. I stripped off my clothes trying to get rid of them, but it felt like they were everywhere. I started thinking back to that Craigslist listing. What kind of person would send someone 10,000 ants? Why did they do this? What was the point? I had no answers, but I knew I had to get rid of them fast before my whole apartment was overrun. I grabbed whatever I could to try and contain them. Old boxes, anything I could find to scoop them into. But they kept escaping, crawling over everything. The worst part, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. This one is on the house, or rather in the house. What did that even mean? Was this some kind of sick prank? Was I the target of some twisted joke? Or was there something more to it? I spent the next few hours battling ants. It felt like an eternity, and by the time I managed to clear most of them out of my apartment, I felt completely drained. But there was still this feeling of dread in my stomach. I couldn't shake the thought that I had just been part of something far more messed up than a simple Craigslist exchange. Who was this person? Why did they want to mess with me? What did they want from me? I decided to do what any rational person would do, report it. I contacted Craigslist and told them what had happened, but they just shrugged it off. They said I should block the user and move on. That's it. No help and no support. Just a simple sorry, that's not our problem. I tried to track down the seller, but the ad was gone. His profile had vanished. There was no trace of him, like he never existed. All I had left was a bad feeling, a memory of ants crawling all over me, over my furniture, over everything. I've since moved, and I haven't been back to that apartment. I still don't know who sent those ants or why, and to be honest, I'm not sure I want to know. It was just too weird, too creepy. It wasn't just a prank. It felt personal, like I was the target of something bigger. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: don't mess around with weird Craigslist ads. And if someone offers you 10,000 ants, maybe just keep scrolling. Trust me, you don't want to find out what happens next.